Welcome to Everyday Tarot, your daily dive into the divine wisdom of the tarot. I'm your host, Camille A. Saunders, and today I'll be talking about the Devil card. Whether you're a seasoned tarot reader or just starting to explore, this podcast offers daily insights, intuitive messages, and practical advice drawn from the cards. Each episode is designed to help you connect with your inner wisdom, find clarity in your decisions, and tap into the energy of the universe. Tune in every day, Monday through Friday, for fresh perspectives and empowering guidance from the tarot as interpreted by me. The best way to support the podcast right now is to listen daily, rate, review, and to follow or subscribe in your chosen podcast app. The next best way is to check out my Patreon. Supporting me there gives you early access to upcoming podcast episode topics, digital downloads I've created, and monthly tarot hangouts with me and other listeners. The link will be in the show notes to check that out. You can always go to my website, CamilleASaunders.com/everydaytarot for all the latest information related to the podcast and to find images of the cards I pull. If you're local to the greater Puget Sound area in Washington State, I'd love to see you at one of my Let's Talk Tarot meetup group events, where we will all bring some of our favorite decks and play around with tarot and oracle cards together. Maybe you'll even find a deck that you really like and can search for that particular one in the future. Our next meetup is actually tonight, Monday, February 10th at 6 p.m. at Katy Downs in Tacoma. More information is in the link in the show notes for how to RSVP for that. All right, into our main discussion. So, welcome to season 3 of the podcast. In the first season, I introduced tarot through talking about oracle versus tarot cards, myths of tarot, how to find a deck, reading for yourself versus others, and much more. In season 2, I went through the first 13 cards of the Major Arcana, one per episode, and now we're into season 3, where I will go through the final 9 cards in the Major Arcana and then talk about each suit. So, as I said earlier, today I'm talking about the Devil card. And this card, the number associated with the card is 15 in the Major Arcana numbers. So numerology for the number 15 is about peace, stability, boundaries, harmony, luxury, and a balance of independence and personal freedom. And traits associated with 15s are mysterious, charming, and sensual. So when we think about depictions of the Devil card, there's some commonly seen symbols across different decks. So often there's sort of the Christian devil imagery on the card. Sometimes there's pentagrams, sometimes flames, or a showing of sort of like the angel wings, or like the devil as a fallen angel. Sometimes there's shackles or like chains around a person. And then often it's shown as Baphomet. And in the Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker, they have many pages on depictions or ideas about the devil, but I wanted to read a specific part sort of talking about the depiction of Baphomet. So the Christian devil became a composite of ancient deities in a single protean form. He had the goat horns and hoofs of satyr gods like Pan, Marsus, and Dionysus, the trident of Neptune, Hades, or Shiva, the reptilian form of Leviathan, Python, or Ouroboros, the fiery form of Agni or Helios, the female breasts of Ashtarte or Ishtar, the wolf face of Dis, Phoroneus, or Fenrir, and the quadruple wings of Babylonian cherubim, the bird claws of ancestral spirits, the Aves, and all the god names Christians had ever heard. And then it sort of goes on to list a lot of those, including Hades, Pluto, Lucifer, what else? Adonais, Emmanuel, Samuel, Jupiter. And it said the devil could take any shape, even a human one. And there's lots of different depictions of that, but I thought that that was like a interesting depiction of sort of what we often see is that they talk about that it's sort of this composite of like all these different gods, and often ones that were seen as not necessarily like purely good or sort of again like the sensuality, the charm, the like trickster, a lot of that type of energy. In the Library of Esoterica, tarot book by Taschen, they talk about other symbology of the card. They also talk about Baphomet as being half man, half goat, with the forked tail and bat wings, and then the symbol of the inverted pentagram, often like on their forehead. It says that often, like again, it's depicted with like a naked man and woman chained to like a stone pedestal or chained to the devil, which is supposed to be depicting the devil's like dominion over and enslavement of them. Um, it says that part of the interesting thing is that often when the chains are depicted or that kind of thing, if you like really look at the chains or the shackles, it sort of looks like um, the shackles are like loose, like they could be taken off. And we'll get into some meanings in a moment, but it is sort of this idea of like that maybe they're there on their own volition or sort of like they're allowing it to happen. Or again, like you could remove the chains if you really wanted, but there's this sort of like, I don't know, self-flagellation aspect of it or like self-deprecating of like sort of choosing to be in that space. If we look at some of the decks that I have, in the Anima Mundi deck. And then again, this is a deck that often depicts different animals or plants or even like mountains or other like things in nature. And for the devil card, they depict a human. So again, humans are animals, but we don't always think of ourselves that way. And it's like a person sort of curled up in the fetal position. And again, they sort of have chains like going to them, but you can't really tell where they're connected or if they're connected at all. And on this one, there is like the inverted pentagram at the top of the card. Um, in my Therapist Who Tarot deck, there's sort of a watercolor depiction of, I would say, Baphomet. So sort of the like horned head that sort of looks like a goat, and then like two legs, like a person, and then these big wings that do kind of look like bat wings depicted on there. And there's a lot of like dark colors on this card, so like dark purple and black and gray for most of it, and then the horns and ears are a little bit like lighter colored. And this deck has a word at the bottom of each card underneath the title of the card, and this one says greed. And then in the Goddess of Love tarot deck, there's this card has a lot going on it, but again, it has sort of like a person depicted. There's a snake on there. The person has these large, I would say, sort of like angel-looking wings, but they're red. And again, there's a lot of like red imagery, so like red raindrops or teardrops falling from the wings. There is a pentagram on top, although it's not inverted, it's upright. And then on each of like the points, there are roses, red roses on the 5 points. And like the snake that's depicted on the person is like its head is like over top of the person or the goddess's head. So again, there's sort of this like animal face look to it on that card. So that's kind of where the depictions go for this card. As we get more into the meanings, again, there's sort of the like Christian idea of the devil. So sort of just like almost like all the different devilish traits or like anything sort of bad. But often again, sort of not that different from like a benevolent God, but sort of like maybe using their powers in a way that is seen as like not good. Um, there's an interesting quote in the Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets that I referenced earlier. It says, "Everything which is unknown lies in the cursed domain of demonology, for there are no unexplained facts. Whatever is not normal is due to the devil." And I do think that that is like what comes up a lot. It also talks about that like the devil or like the singular devil versus like devils. That it's sort of yeah, it goes back and forth between like a monotheistic idea and polytheistic. So again, like one god or many gods. And a lot of times, like in Christianity, I would say that it almost is this idea that like any other types of worship or any, right, like pagan worship was seen this way, especially early on in Christianity, that like all other types of worship that aren't Christianity are like the devil. Which again, we definitely see some people feel that way about tarot or divination or like witchcraft type things. That it's like, oh, okay, like there's this idea that like, okay, there's Christianity, and then everything or anything that diverts from that is seen as like evil or devilish or demon-esque. In the last part of the description for the devil in the Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets really talks about that, like sort of in our more modern society. I mean, I guess this was written a little while ago, but it talks about that, like, you might think that modern society has given up the idea of the devil, or that when we maybe understand more things about science or enlightenment, that we don't explain everything away as like a demon or a devil. It talks about that a poll taken in 1978 showed 2 out of 5 Americans believe in devils. Um, and that there is this idea that, okay, like if in Christianity and Judaism, that if God is given credit for all like the good things in human history, then men, right, like or humans must take the blame for everything else. And then it talks about, so okay, if we can like sort of parse that out, maybe that means that the real purpose of the devil in this ideology is to take some of the responsibility off of humans. So it's saying that like the devil and not Christ was the true scapegoat of who assumed the burden of human sins. And again, this sort of goes back to the idea of the beginning of the Christian Bible in the Old Testament of Adam and Eve and sort of like falling into temptation, eating the forbidden fruit, and that sort of like, and then from there, humans were doomed to sin forever and ever, um, and that sort of idea. So again, if we sort of extrapolate this and then think about the devil card itself, it's a little more about, yeah, maybe like a little bit of that like temptation idea. So in the Toshan book, it talks about attributes with this card. It would say like the devil demands honesty and self-assessment, or it sometimes requires a confrontation and acceptance of one's own desires. Sometimes like this comes up around like addiction or impulse or manipulation, a signifier of entrapment, lack of fulfillment, and reliance on the material rather than the spiritual. To move past him, one must go deep, face faults, and find forgiveness. He welcomes indulgence, gluttony, and temptation, and yet the devil can be embraced as well. He offers fertile soil for creativity, igniting passion, fueling the glowing pyre of ideas and imagination. In the dark spaces there emerges the poetry of shadows. We place the chains around our own neck. To be freed of the devil's shackles, we must remove our own masks and face our own demons. And what I'm thinking of right now, especially with sort of the words around addiction or sort of like falling into something or temptation, is like screens, scrolling, social media, and a lot of the things that I think like our attention goes to these days, and that it can really feel like this like pulling you in, that it feels like you can get like lost in it, right? That you might have an intention to only spend a certain amount of time on social media or doing a certain activity or sort of like distracting yourself from right might be going on for you in the day to day, and that but that really right like what if to sort of like get out of that, right, we have to also like take, like they said, kind of take the chains around our off of our own neck, that sort of we can't rely necessarily on anyone else or algorithms or platforms necessarily to set boundaries for us, since seemingly they really don't like to do so. They like us to be on there all the time and to be sucked in, and to sort of feel like if you aren't on there, if you aren't checking in or paying attention, or even like in the news cycle this way, that if you're not watching 24/7, you're missing out. And how can you go about living your life if you're not informed about those things? And so I know for me, like, a lot of the ways that I go about maybe dealing with that, like temptation of it, or like maybe greed, or just like that feel of like addiction to it, is like setting timers, I have a lot of like programmed, what would be the right word? You can go into the digital wellness area of most smartphones and like put restrictions on yourself, basically, of like how much time you can spend on certain apps or at certain times a day, what apps are available to you and not. And right now, especially during winter time when I want to, right, sometimes there is this inclination to like hibernate or to just sort of like not be present to like the day to day all the time when it's darker and there's more like dark hours of the day where we might want to spend it on doing things that are maybe like not so great for us. I have pretty strict like parts on my phone, like that once, but basically between sunset and sunrise, that it turns off a lot of my apps and I can't use them. My phone goes into grayscale mode, which just means like it looks like black and white. So if you're looking at pictures, especially on social media, you get like less basically enjoyment out of it. It's like less appealing to look at for our brains, and it can just make it a little bit easier to like disengage with that. It's also, you can kind of understand what's going on in a photo when it's black and white, but it's not like the shiny, pretty, multicolored thing that it normally is. Um, and I know, again, for me, like if I just intentionally tried to, for example, only go on my Instagram for a certain amount of time per day, like that sounds great in theory, but then I would get to the end of the week and I could look at my phone on Sundays where it does like a summary of how much time you spend on different apps. It would say that I spent like way more time than I wanted on things like Instagram, social media, even though like I had sort of intentionally for myself been like, no, get off of that. So I had to kind of like put these restrictions on myself. Um, so yeah, I guess to pull it back to the meanings of the devil card here, there is this sort of, yeah, idea of like maybe, right, that we're sort of like putting ourselves in this space that, right, I can blame the creators of the social media algorithms or other things that are designed to get my attention. And I can do that and complain about it and do all sorts of things about it. But if I'm not really changing my own relationship with it, um, it's probably not going to happen. I can't rely on other people for that. So in the Fearless Tarot book by Elia Adam, How to Give a Positive Reading in Any Situation, under the devil card, it talks about that the devil is about confronting your inner saboteur, or again, the parts of yourself that might sabotage, again, those good intentions, those goals, those visions. And that it talks about nobody likes to confront the devil. The devil can be a jarring image to face, and this is because it represents our shadow self and the inner saboteur. This is the insidious voice within us that tells us we aren't worthy, that we can't be successful, and that we are stuck with our lot. Often this voice pipes up just before we're about to make a huge breakthrough. This voice comes as a final test to see what we really believe about ourselves. The devil's known by many names, but by far the most fitting is the Prince of Lies. The biggest lie the devil tells us is that they are more powerful than we are. Each day you have a choice to believe the voice that tells you you're garbage, or to hear your better angels who remind you that you are worthy. So yeah, again, if you think about kind of your own life, like how does your shadow manifest in your life? Do you struggle with self-esteem, self-worth? Do you feel trapped in situations that feel beyond your control? And then sort of when you feel those things, right, like think about what you normally do. Again, in my professional world, I'm a mental health therapist. And so thinking about, yeah, what are like the coping mechanisms that you reach for? And again, like the coping mechanisms, right? They're tools. Like I don't necessarily want to judge them because a lot of times, like, yeah, we do judge them, right? And then we go back to, we get in that cycle of like, oh, I'm garbage, right? I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't be on social media this much, la, 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 about that. And, right, that doesn't really help us either. Another book I haven't talked about so much before, but kind of on this mental health note, is called Tarot for Change, Using the Cards for Self-Care, Acceptance, and Growth by Jessica Dorr. And I really liked some of the things she was talking about with the Devil card. Um, that thinking about the devil, right, again, is sort of this context of addictive behaviors. It can happen kind of compulsively. Um, Sometimes there's so little space between the stimulus and the response that the behavior feels automatic, right? Like, again, especially if you have social media or maybe you check your email all the time, or as I've talked about in other episodes, I'm out there scrolling, looking at houses, sometimes properties. So sometimes even that, I have to sort of restrict myself on those apps as well. So I'm not staying up too late at night looking to find the perfect place for me. Um, and that like you can find yourself, right, just going back and like clicking on the thing without even thinking about it. I know for me, when I first started like getting back into reading fiction again, about maybe like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, when I first started reading again, like an IRL book, a hard copy book, I could read like maybe a page or two before I would like have the desire to pick up my phone, which was so wild to me because as a kid, I used to read so much and just like constantly, I would read a whole book in a day. I would read multiple books in a day. I remember being very proud. I read 5 books in 2 days one time in high school when we were like on vacation. So yeah, just that like automatic behavior too. Again, like as humans, we're great at like creating habits and routines. And when those are serving us, it's great. But also sometimes having habits and routines that we don't love, like our bodies are still really good at like having those ingrained in us. I know some people talk about sort of like if you were driving some kind of vehicle that like the habit or the routine that you normally go down are like the grooves from the tires. And if you take the same route all the time, right, the grooves are very deep. And so when you try to, right, go read a book real quickly or like do something different, like not get on social media or again, whatever your chosen addiction is, then it's that much harder to kind of get out of those grooves. So yeah, in this book by Jessica Dorr, she does a good job of explaining kind of the habitual use of behaviors, like that can come at a really high cost, right? Like they are coping strategies, um, but also they might not be like supporting growth or learning from things, and they often work when we've got nothing else to choose from, right? Which is why I don't want to demonize um, these sort of coping mechanisms because like they do help us. They do sort of serve a purpose. It's just sometimes when you're able to like zoom out or right when you get into a situation where you feel better supported or better able to not do those things or you want to be intentional about it, um, we can decide that those things aren't serving us anymore. And if no one around you like has better methods, right, or has taught you how to effectively manage ways of like what scares you or stresses you out, right, then like I totally understand why we choose certain things, right? Like social media is a great distraction from some of the things that are going on in our day to day life. looking at pictures, things like that. It totally makes sense. So I definitely don't like blame anyone for that, right? And it's just like sometimes we also pull up those, those addictive behavior things when we're trying to avoid something, whether that's like feelings or discomfort or again like doing things that we don't want to do. And we do experience like temporary relief, right? Like distraction works pretty well. And again, the longer you sort of do that behavior coping mechanism, the longer, um, right, that like you get to sort of avoid the other thing that you're trying not to think about or feel or sort of deal with. And it just sometimes that can reinforce the idea, like in our brains, that um, that what we're avoiding, like, is dangerous. We've sort of can teach our bodies sometimes that, like, oh yeah, okay, like this is yeah, I can't do that because that's uncomfortable, and so therefore I'm going to do all these other things. Um, and often, like, again, those things that we turn away from, right, again, a lot of that can just not serve us in the long term, or it just prolongs the experience of like dealing with that thing. Um, so if we're avoiding like grief or anxiety, um, right, like it's just going to sort of perpetuate perhaps the cycle of feeling that grief and anxiety because we're not actually like dealing with it. Um, so a lot of coping mechanisms are like elaborate ways that we turn away from pain or psychological defenses, right? Whether that's like physical pain or sort of emotional pain. Um, and I know a thing I'm working on is actually like allowing myself to feel emotions and like deal with them when they do come up instead of just pushing them down or thinking, oh, I'll deal with that later, or this is an inconvenient time, or oh, I have to be professional, so I'm not allowed to have feelings, right? Actually, we have feelings all the time. Everyone does. And being able to actually like name them and identify them can help us sort of, again, make intentional choices about how we want to deal with them, right? Like you can make an intentional choice that you want to have distraction right now, and I'm going to do that for 20 minutes on my lunch break, right? Like, great. If that's your intentional choice and that you feel like that's serving you, then like, wonderful. I think it's just when we get into those like loops of feeling like unintentional choices or feeling like, again, we kind of have those like chains around our neck, as often depicted in this card. Um, that certain thoughts or feelings or sensations, I think we often build them up as like they're bigger and more powerful than they actually are, or like that we are. And so sometimes, like, again, if we don't kind of deal with those things, if we don't allow ourselves to process feelings whenever they do come up, it's like, oh man, I'm going to have such a backlog of feelings and emotions to deal with that's now really overwhelming, right? And I'm just going to sort of keep perpetuating this cycle of like, no, what if I just push it off? What if I do it later? And we have to, right, if we want to like take those chains off, take the thing off from around our neck, and be free of some of those behaviors or things that we don't want to be doing, right, we have to set boundaries and we have to figure out how to do that. Um, we have to have the intention or the things that we are going to deal with and having ways of dealing with that and learning that. And if you don't have ways of dealing with that or have support or learning about that, in my opinion, therapy is a great place to do that, is to learn skills and to practice and to have someone to sort of help teach you, but also keep you accountable in kind of the things that you might want to break free from. So I know that was a long, maybe tangent, longer than I usually go on around meanings around this card. So to pull it back into the tarot and the idea of the devil, I'm going to talk through the last kind of depiction in the Goddess of Love tarot deck. So there's a goddess depicted here, and for this card, it is Lilith. It says the astrological correspondence is Capricorn. And it talks about to liberate yourself from the expectations and desires of another and to live your life on your own terms is very powerful. The devil invites you to break the chains, right? Take those off and to release the fear of the depths and depravity of all of life and to be embodied in the experience of humanity. The devil is the anarchist who wields unbridled self-awareness as a source of power, and no one represents that more than, as Gabriela Herstik says, the bad bitch of the Talmud, the book of Jewish commentary on the Torah, Lilith. As Adam's first wife, she refused to be subservient to him, especially during sex. And when he refused anything but missionary sex, Lilith proclaimed the ineffable name of God, sprouted wings, and went to the Red Sea, where she birthed scores of demon children by having sex with men as they slept. Or so the story goes. Lilith represents the uncontrollable, erotic, divine feminine. She represents the power of the devil as a liberating force and as a source of fear. It's only when one is unfamiliar with their own power that another's seems like such a threat. This is Lilith's gift, total autonomy. Lilith doesn't adhere to religious, social, or political norms, and to worship at her altar is to worship at the totality of the self. Which again, I think, right, in my opinion, because of Christianity and the religious sort of built up ideas of the devil and of these ideas of temptation or sort of what the devil or demons depict, there is this sort of demonizing of autonomy, right? Or of like prioritizing the self that this card, right, really calls us to sort of examine at the very least and perhaps let go of. And again, sort of that part of embracing the full experience of humanity is also feeling what we call often negative emotions, which are really just emotions that we're putting judgment on because they're maybe uncomfortable or we don't know how to deal with them, or, right, they're going to bring tears or anger or grief that just feels really big and feels like our day-to-day life and workplace and culture are not great at allowing, right? It's definitely not a personal failing if you haven't learned how to actually allow your emotions and feel them in that way, because our culture, at least in the US, in my opinion, does not allow for a lot of that. There's not a lot of room for grief and rage and autonomy. There's a lot of other things that are in contrast to that a lot of the time. So yeah, with this card, it's sort of thinking about like how can you reclaim, right, that self-worth, that self-esteem, your autonomy, um, and sort of examining some of those things that might cause you fear. I know I have some things coming to mind right now of sort of things that I've built up in my own mind of, oh, I can't do that, or one time I had a bad experience, or it was uncomfortable, right? Like those things can be true, but that doesn't mean I never need to do that thing again, or that I should allow those experiences to inform my future, and to sort of limit myself in that way, right? If this card calls us to autonomy and to taking off those chains, sometimes again, the chains are things that we put there ourselves or that our brain has sort of decided is unhelpful or painful or uncomfortable, and therefore we'll just avoid it, right? Again, it's very common, but just sort of pointing out that, right, this is really the embodiment of this card is that ability to examine it, like ourselves and our shadow side and our intentions and sort of think about what we want in the future. All right, so let's dive in and see what the cards have to say today on this theme. All right, so today I pulled from the Sasarabita Tarot deck by Stasia Burrington, and as I did so, again, I was thinking about the themes of the Devil card. What do I need to think about my autonomy around? What sort of things do I feel shackled to or might that I might benefit from examining further. And I pulled Justice, so another Major Arcana card that I talked about recently. So if you remember, Justice card is, right, again, sometimes about literal justice. It's also about balance between like your physical state and spirit. It's about being fair, impartiality, objectivity. Um, and as I think about that, I think about sort of, okay, like maybe how do you take a objective um, view as you sort of delve into examining your shadow or things that you maybe don't love that you do or behaviors that go about, again, sort of, for example, those like being on social media, scrolling all the time, if that's not a thing you want to do or feel like great about. And then I feel like this card's telling us of like, okay, like find the balance, right? Like, what are the things you want to get done? What are your goals? What are your vision? And then sort of what are the things that you feel like are holding you back right now? And can we try to take a sort of objective, perhaps, view of some of those coping mechanisms that you don't feel like are serving you, right? Not saying you need to feel bad about it or like that we need to beat ourselves up in any way, but just sort of stepping back and viewing, right? Again, one way to do this is to look at that digital wellness on your phone, or look at your like screen time for the week. Again, most smartphones have the ability to like tell you what apps you spent time on. And again, this is just an example, but right, being able to sort of review and reflect with a bit of objectivity so that we don't get sort of pulled down into this kind of like devil mindset of feeling like, oh, I can't change that, right? Oh, I'm just going to leave those shackles on because that's easier. So thinking about, okay, like how do we find balance? How do we, right, weigh what feels like helpful behaviors that are propelling us towards the future that we want to have and the ones that are maybe holding us back. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today on Everyday Tarot. If you ever want to see the cards that I pull or the images, um, the links for the tarot decks I use are in the show notes and on my website. And just as a reminder, the podcast comes out daily, Monday through Friday for all of 2025. Thanks for joining me on Everyday Tarot today. See you soon. Bye-bye.